Hey, Links Outdoors here. So what I wanted to do was make a follow-up video for my Durston Xmid Pro tent. So if you haven't seen it, check out the link in the description. I have a very detailed 50-minute long video where I used this tent for the Continental Divide Trail last year. So I used it for 3,000 miles of backpacking and shared a lot of my pros and cons, showed how the tent held up after all that, and that's a much more detailed video. This isn't meant to be another super long deep dive. This is more of a companion video, so if you haven't checked that one out, I recommend you go check it out first. That being said, I used the same exact tent, not just the same model, but the specific exact same tent for most of the Pacific Crest Trail this year. And so by most, the reason I didn't use it for all was because in Southern California, where there weren't a lot of bugs or rain, I started off with a tarp. And once the flies started getting annoying, I switched to this roughly around the 450 mile point, and then I used this till the very end. Okay, so this tent has done the entire Continental Divide Trail and almost all of the Pacific Crest Trail. So let's just do a walk around so you can take a look at how the tent actually looks. There is no damage or issue anywhere on any of the side panels. I haven't had any issues with the vents. So overall, the side panels and everything have held up great. A couple issues did happen with the tent. I'm sure you can see one right here. So the main issue that I do have with this tent in general are the zippers. They're very lightweight zippers to keep the weight down, but in my opinion, because of the tension that's put on the zippers by kind of doing a sideways pull when the tent is set up, it does put more sideways pull on the zippers than a lot of other tents do. And so because of that, this zipper is basically dead. It's tired. I'm going to try to replace it myself, and I'll probably make a video of trying to do that and show you how it comes out. But anyway, this is the biggest issue that I had with the tent the whole time. It did a very good job. It started separating like this, I would say probably about 2,000 miles into the PCT. And to be fair, it's an ultralight trekking pole DCF tent with pretty lightweight zippers. Zippers don't last for infinity. On other tents, I've had to replace them too. So that being said, I had the zipper sliders replaced. So I'm pretty confident it's not the zipper sliders. I think it's actually the teeth of the zippers. And so they're basically due to be replaced. The other issues that I've eventually run into, and again, this isn't unique to this tent. I'm sure you can notice the slightly off color repair job there. So along the cups of the top where the trekking poles go, you can see there's a bunch of repair there. And what it's actually like underneath there is tiny, tiny, tiny little pinholes. And so those have happened kind of along the ridge line. There hasn't been any that have been down lower, but both of the trekking pole cups really started to have separation against the grain, if that makes sense. So like if you can see on the DCF here, all of the threads in this run one direction. And so the DCF is really strung in line, but it can stretch out sideways just because there's a really thin sheet of mylar holding all those threads together. So it's incredibly strong in its intended direction of pull, but over time it does stretch out or start to separate slightly. And a lot of times you get these little pinholes, which is what the case was for this tent. That being said, it wasn't catastrophic. Even when it rained, which was not much, I didn't notice any water dripping in through the pinholes, but I'm sure that it could. And the reason that I have all this patched was basically because I had time. I actually did the repair job at Shelter Cove in Oregon, and I had a whole bunch of time in the afternoon, so that's kind of what I did, is I just went inside and looked up and tried to see where I could see the sky through the tent, and then I would kind of go outside and try to put a little sticker over it. So with that being said, let me see if I can find any new ones that have happened since that spot, so you can kind of see what it looks like from the inside. Here's an example. You can see the spot that's not taped, that's right in the center, where those are sort of the pinholes that I'm talking about that are starting to form. You can see some more too, kind of like right up here. And so that's what a lot of these patches are for, is they're not cuts, but they're actually for these tiny little pinholes. And like I said, I did get a fair bit of rain in Washington, and I didn't have any drips inside the tent, but I just wanted to share that after, what does this tent have? I would say easily over 5,000 miles on it, probably closer to 5,200. The current areas of wear are along the ridgeline and really focusing around the cups where the trekking poles go. One thing that is very nice to see was that the major wear on the CDT, which are the corners on the short side of the vestibules on both ends, they started to separate and stretch rather significantly. But the repair on here worked excellent, and I didn't have to do anything for these corners at all the entire Pacific Crest Trail. Okay, let's talk about the floor. So in my very first impression video, which I'll put the link in the description, I was concerned about how thin the floor is. The material is very thin, you can kind of see through it. And because of that, I used a ground sheet on the Continental Divide Trail the whole time. I used a couple different kinds. And a lot of people have asked me, do I think a ground sheet's necessary with this tent? Well, on the Pacific Crest Trail, I didn't bring a ground cloth at all, or footprint ground sheet. I mean, you know what I'm talking about. I use that three different words kind of interchangeably. But the footprint is something I left behind this time, and I didn't have a single noticeable leak. My air mattress, I use a thicker Neo Air inflatable one. It didn't get a single pinhole leak, which oftentimes would happen from something sharp poking through the floor, on the entire CDT or PCT. Anyway, the floor has no holes in it. I'm not overly careful when it comes to picking my spot. Like if I see pine cones and stuff, I'll kind of shoo them away, but I don't go nuts. I don't get down there with a magnifying glass and tweezers and try to remove every single sharp object. So I'm very impressed with the floor. There is no obvious wear, no punctures. So one of the things that I've had a few people ask for help with is determining like where you're going to lay inside the tent, of course, on the floor, because the outside of the tent isn't traditional rectangular square, so your body's a little bit crooked in there. So I'm going to use this sleeping mat not as a actual sleeping mat, but I'm going to use it as like a position to show you if you want to lie down in that very specific spot. Because even though this tent has a relatively large footprint, all you really have to focus on is where your body's going to be while you're sleeping. Because if you can find a flat spot that is wide enough for your pad, it's okay if you have slopes or rocks or roots or things inside your vestibules. So in this case, this is my target. So this is where I actually want to lie down for the night in this example. The first thing you want to do is get the tent out. And I'm going to do it upside down the first time. And you wouldn't do this, of course, but I just want to do this as a demo to show you how I do this. So you want to start with one hand on the foot or head sides. And so you'll notice when I spread this out, the floor is actually crooked. So you have to focus on where the floor is going to be. So if I wanted to line up on this mat, what I'll essentially do is I'll try to flake it out and focus on getting the floor directly over where I want to sleep. It might sound obvious, but some people have talked about having a hard time figuring out where the floor is going to be when they're setting up the tent. So this is just something I wanted to show, because if you focus on the floors where you're actually spreading the tent out, you can position it pretty accurately. So now to do the same thing without it being upside down. So basically you always want to start with the right-hand corner, because this is going to be where your body is. The left-hand side is where the vestibule is going to be. So if you start off by holding the bottom of the floor and you kind of flake the tent out, look at the bottom as it's starting to come back down. And do your best just to sort of lay it down on where you want it to go. So from here, I've got my bathtub floor where I want, which is important. The next thing is to stake out the four corners. And I do have a couple tips for you that I've learned along this most recent through hike. So again, the order that you stake out the tent does matter if you want to keep that positioning. So the first thing you want to do is start with the spot closest to the floor. And your goal here is to make these 45-degree lines of the guy lines go straight into the corners. And now do your best to not move this because you already have it positioned exactly where you want it to be. So I kind of spread out the corner until I see the far guy line moving a little bit. And then same thing, I try to put this in at about a 45-degree angle. So that's going to position my body pretty well. So now I like to come down to this end, grab the middle, and just give it a little bit of a pull, and that's going to kind of distribute the load onto those two far guy lines. While holding the middle, doesn't matter which side you do, make it relatively taut while you're holding the middle. And same deal, you're going to put another stake in 45 degrees to the corner. And the last one is a bit of a piece of cake. If you did all the other ones right, this last one will be fine. Okay, so another thing that people have asked about is, does it matter when you tighten the corner guy lines? Because in the setup videos by Durston, they show them tightening them as they're doing this step. But what I've found is that I actually prefer to have them intentionally too loose. So you can see that this is not taut. I have it just taut enough to like kind of hold the rectangular shape, but none of these guy lines are snug. And there's a reason for that, and I'll show you that now. So once you have all of this taken care of, the next thing that you do is zip up the vestibule. And here's a couple like really simple tips for you. Start with this higher one already undone. And then focusing on getting the trekking pole cap sideways in the cup actually holds it a little bit better. By cup, I mean the spot in the tent here. So I'm going to take this, put it in sideways, press it up into there. And now while I'm holding it up with one hand, I find the little trekking pole tip elastic. And if I can, I put that down as far as I can, actually push it into the ground. And then what I used to do was raise this up as high as it could go. But what I've actually come to find is that I get a much better pitch overall, and it sets up a lot easier on slopes, which is another issue that folks have issues with. If I pay attention to the floor. So if the tent is too low, it's a sloppy fit. The bathtub floor isn't raised up high enough, and it makes using the zippers much more difficult. And if you raise it too high, you actually lose interior space because you're lifting it up off of the ground and creating more of a round-shaped bottom than that. So what I've found is when I leave these things loose on purpose, the guy lines, if I raise it up until the floor becomes taut, I leave it there. After each one, you can zip the vestibule again and do the same exact thing on the other side. Okay, so you can probably see it's a very sloppy pitch right now. This would get blown all over the place in the wind. So now, once I have the floor the correct height, and again, to show you what I mean by that. Okay, and so now it's basically really floppy. And now you can go around, and I don't have a set pattern for this, I just go for whatever's the closest. But a tip to get it a little bit tighter is if you take one hand on the tent and the other on the guy line, use your hand to pull the tent. It makes getting the slack out just that much easier. You're not putting quite as much pressure on the line locks. And so this actually is a pretty good pitch. You can see that the ridge line is nice and taut, and all the sides are nice and taut too. And so I found from the experience on the PCT that this is my preferred way to pitch it, because you come out with the tent being set up better, usually on the first try. You don't usually have to go around and mess with anything, or like walk back around and loosen or tighten any of that stuff. So from this view, it looks like the floor is actually a little sloppy. That's really just because of the tall grass. If you are able to see right here, this is actually snug. So So it kind of looks like a sloppy pitch, but that's really just because the grass is getting kind of tall. I need to mow it. So I just wanted to show you, you can probably see the waves on the floor in there. When I went to set up the tent on that mat, I was able to get the bathtub floor exactly on the mat, and that was my intended target. So another thing that folks have asked about a fair amount is, what about when you don't have an ideal spot to stake the tent out? And let's be fair here, there is no such thing as a trekking pole tent that really thrives in that situation. They're not freestanding tents. Again, this sleeping mat right here I'm using as a demo. That's where I want my body to be. So I don't put a sleeping mat down on the ground before I sleep. This is purely for a visual target of where I'm trying to set up the tent. So once again, real quick recap, I start with either the head or the foot. It is symmetrical, it doesn't matter which side. And I focus on my right hand. And I'm flipping this up and I'm trying to get the floor of the tent where I want my body to be, which is what that sleeping mat is supposed to represent. So in this case, what I would actually do is I would stake in the sides that I can get in first. And again, when I'm doing this, and when you do this, you should start with where your body is going to be, because you don't want the tent to shift since you focused on where you're going to lie it down. So in this case, this is the floor with the corner here. It's always on the right-hand side. Okay, so now I have the two ends that I can actually stake in. And so now I'm going to show you a couple of things that you can do for the less than ideal spots. So there's really two methods that I found that I used during my last 2 through hikes. The first is the easiest, and what I would normally do is I would try to find a rock. And I would take a stake, and this is called a deadman's anchor, which is not a very pleasant name, but... And I would usually try to find a flat rock, and then I would usually try to find a heavier rock and pinch it like so. And you can't pull it that tight. Again, you're not going to get an amazing pitch when you can't get stakes in the ground, but that was usually my go-to. If you have really soft, squishy ground, sometimes you don't need the bottom rock. And then sometimes that isn't going to work out. So this is my Guyline accessory kit that I carried for the PCT and the CDT. If you watched my other video on this, you'll know it's kept in here. I have one hank of cord. This is all the 1.25 millimeter Xmid cord, it's called. This is miscellaneous. I use this for clotheslines and additional guy outs. This is just like candy cord. But I personally keep 3 of these little hanks of cord. These 2 are the same, and then this is an extra long one. And all of these things have these titanium, I think they're titanium, either that or aluminum. They're extremely light. These little, I think they're called ringworms, and they're from a company called Dutchware that makes a lot of hammock parts. And so what I do for these is I have 2 lengths that are yay long. That's probably about 6 feet. On one end, I have just a tied overhand knot to give me something to put the stake in. And then on the other end, I have a simple overhand knot. This is just a blocking knot, so that way this doesn't fall off the end. But what you can do is, if you have some cordage, you don't have to go nuts with super fancy knots. What I recommend doing is focusing on having the end that you're going to tie this to come out of the bottom of your rocker log. So in this case, what I'm actually going to do is show you the benefits of these accessories. So I'm going to start with this kind of roughly where I want it to be. So basically here. And then if I have a log or a rock or something, this is called a tensionless hitch. Just a couple wraps around the log. Friction is going to do a really good job. And then what I can do on here, can't really see it, is I can use this this ringworm here to just tie that off. And now I can use this. All right, so here we go. And then same thing, you don't want to go nuts really yarding on these because you don't have as secure of a pitch as you would if you had 4 stakes in. But this is pretty decent, all things considered. I feel comfortable just tightening these up a little bit more. And you really don't want to yard on these because you're just going to pull the rocks and things out from there. But anyway, hopefully that's helpful. That's 2 different ways that I've used successfully to anchor out the corners, which are the most important stakes on this tent. Some people have asked about just adding lots of extra guyline, and that won't really work because a perfect pitch on this tent, everything's in line. So from this trekking pole here, along the corner, ideally, the guyline should go straight out 45 degrees. And if it's pitched properly, this guyline should be completely in line with this slope. And if you have a lot of guyline and you stake it out somewhere or tie it to a tree way over there, you're not pulling this in line down into the ground, you're actually pulling it out. So it's gonna be really tight on the bottom, but you're more likely gonna have slop up here. So I wouldn't recommend that. I've also seen people that have tried to just place rocks on the little short guylines, and I just don't recommend doing that. I've heard of somebody that actually damaged their tent doing that. Not the tent's fault at all. That's completely a user issue because you're putting a rock on top of DCF and rock is going to shred that every single time. So hopefully that helps. I'll show you the long one that I have right here real quick too, because some folks were asking about these. Okay, so this is my longer length. I do the exact same thing, 1.25 millimeter zinget cord with an overhand just as a stopping knot. And this particular one, I have about an 8-foot arm span. So this is right around probably like 15, 16 feet, something like that. The other end is exactly the same. It's just a stopping knot with the Dutch wear ringworm. Let me show you how I store these. So I start, and I do the same thing for the shorter ones too. So I start with one ringworm at the end, hold it like so, and I just wrap it around my hands. Nothing fancy. Until I have roughly about a foot left. I get the metal slider out of the way, hold in the middle, and then with the extra tail end here, I do a wrap. And then this is the important part. You don't want to keep wrapping down. You actually want to cross over the one that you just did. So crossing up, wrapping a few times, and then I just do an overhand knot on top of it all like that. So it's a little easier to get undone. I can just pinch right there. I figured I might as well share what I did for stakes. So on the PCT, I bought some carbon fiber stakes with the thought of trying to save some weight. And I talked to some folks and they recommended not bringing those because the ground's really hard. And I'm very glad that I didn't. I wouldn't recommend carbon fiber stakes for the PCT or the CDT. These are the tried and true Groundhog MSR stakes, the full size. These are the exact stakes that I used for all of the CDT and all of the PCT. And this is as much wear as they have. A little bit of the color anodizing came off. I brought 4 of these large ones, and that's what I did for the 4 corners. I didn't lose a single one, and I still have them all. They're in terrific shape. On the CDT, I brought these like little smaller pins that were actually carbon fiber, and they broke. So I only used those on the doors because there's not as much weight strain on those. And then this time on the PCT, I switched to the mini Groundhogs, also made by MSR, just because I wanted to save a little bit of weight. So I would use these for when I guide out the guy out points or on the side panels, and I would use 2 of these on the doors. I carried 8 stakes in total, so 4 of the large MSR Groundhogs and 4 of the minis, and that worked out really well. All right, let's go over some weights with all the repairs that I've done. This little DCF stuff sack has some accessory cord in it, as well as those ringworms. And so this weighs less than an ounce. It's 0.8 ounces. This is my stake bag that I use, and in it currently there's 4 full-sized MSR Groundhogs and 4 mini Groundhogs. And actually I have a quick tip for you too. The way I store these is I always want the 4 big ones first. So I store them tip down. So the guy cord, whatever this is, the pull cord up at the top is always face up, so they're really easy to get out. And then I store the minis upside down so that way all this cordage doesn't get pulled out when I pull out the big ones. So that worked really well for me. So my bundle here of the 4 big, 4 mini, and the stuff sack is 3.5 ounces. Of course, you can use different things if you want. And then the tent, including the stuff sack, as well as my own Guyline corners and all the little DCF tape that I added to it, is tipping the scales currently at 18.2 ounces. So overall, what are my thoughts on the Xmid Pro and how it held up on the Pacific Crest Trail? To be really straightforward, I thought that it did great. I think that DCF as a material is the bigger issue with most of the issues that I had with this tent, with all the little pinholes and such. I don't really blame this tent or its design for those things happening. It has happened to many people on many different brands that use DCF as a main material. I think it's just part of the nature of that material is that it gets pinholes after a lot of use. That being said, the zippers, I personally do believe, are the weakest link on this tent. They're very small, and when you set up the tent really taut, and you're trying to force the zippers closed, it's putting a lot of sideways strain on there. You really have to kind of baby these zippers. And after the CDT, I did have the zipper sliders replaced because I had some separation issues then. And then while babying them very much on the PCT, which was a super softball lob of bad weather. It was almost never windy at night. I didn't get hit by a single thunderstorm in the tent. Anyway, the zippers were pretty much babied, and most of the time I slept with them rolled up for better ventilation, and I still had those separation issues, so it's time to replace the zippers. Again, do I really blame the tent for that? Because of the zippers? Yes and no. I think it's just a byproduct of the way that these zippers work and how they're slightly pulled sideways compared to some other models out there. That being said too, you do have to be fair and just say that zippers are a part of the tent that's usually going to wear out first or need repair. Another issue with the PCT was that it's super dry. I only got precipitation 5 days out of 106 days on the trail. So a lot of the dirt and the grime and dust and things that can get into the zipper wasn't being washed out regularly. Partway through the trip, I did take a toothbrush, not the one I brushed my teeth with, and I did use some soapy water and really brush them out, and they did zip a lot easier after that, but I still had those separation issues for the rest of the trail. So I do plan on replacing these zippers with a stronger water-resistant number 5 YKK zipper. So I'm going to make a video of how that process goes. So stay tuned if you want to check that out. Let me know if there's anything about this tent that you want to know. I think it's fair to say that after 2 through hikes in it, I am pretty much an expert with lots of hands-on experience setting it up and sleeping in it. So if there's anything that I didn't cover in either of these 2 videos, say something in the comments. Go ahead and shoot it out, and then if it's something that I can help you with, I'll definitely get back to you. And if it's something that I think warrants a different video, I can make a video of it if there's enough interest too. Well, I hope that's helpful. I've got a lot of time in this tent, and I'm very happy with it. I still highly recommend it, and I'll let you know how replacing the zippers goes. But I want to thank you so much for watching, and stay tuned because I've got a lot more gear reviews and trip videos coming out soon.